All right, everybody, we are live this afternoon with Professor Davis. This is Dynasty Mir, Search for Uhuru. And today's topic is Black Americans should not be impressed with immigrants. And the reason why we're discussing this is because, let me tell you this, Professor Davis, let me share this story with you.
Sure.
I do sales. I was with a customer, a Greek guy. He was Greek, first generation Greek. Greeks pretty much run the hamburger monopoly in Los Angeles. So I want to share this story because it ties in perfectly with the topic. And so, me, I'm the clean cut professional Black guy. And a lot of times, especially when I was in LA, I would say non-Blacks, were very comfortable. And I would say approaching me and discussing their gripes, I guess, with Black Americans, because, I was the token, well, you're not complaining, you're dressed nice and speak well. So what's the other Black people's problem? Why can't they put themselves up by the bootstraps? So basically this Greek guy, me and him talking, I'm trying to sell him my product. And he says, Dinus, why do Black people always complain? Look at me. We came from Greece and look what we have. So, and then I had a situation, Brent. This time I want to say he was from Thailand. He was Thai. And he said to me, Dinus, and again, I'm doing sales. I'm making sales calls and doing my presentations. And he says, Dinus, why do Black people always complain about slavery when everyone's slaves? And, I had to break it down that, the Black experience when it comes to slavery, the African experience is unique in itself. I had to break it down all the way from our language being stolen. Had to break all the way down. And then he was
I understand.
Yeah, and then he was like, okay, all right. And then as far as Black Americans, we were told, stop complaining, look at the Chinese, look at the Asian immigrants, look at how Nigerians, they come and they're very successful. So what's your problem? So, and then a lot of times, I'm serious. And then, me, Professor Davis, we,
right.
We have to break down really how a lot of immigrants refuse to acknowledge the sacrifices and quite frankly, the hell, seriously, the hell Black people went through to establish this country and make these immigrants make their transition easier. Seriously.
Exactly.
Because at the end of the day, you have Black Americans leaving some, but we're looked at as crazy, the ones who are considered leaving, because we're leaving because America's already established. Why we leave and go to a third world country when disrespect towards and not realizing the sacrifices Black Americans made to make it possible for them to come here. We'll talk about Booker T. Washington and the African Exclusionary Act. Civil rights. Just about everything.
Right.
But do we not be impressed with immigrants? Professor Davis.
Well, first of all, most immigrants are very, very ignorant when it comes to the African American contributions to the United States. And I tell my friends, American friends, non-African American friends who are of other races, that Black Americans are a special group within the context of the United States. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is every group to this country were voluntary immigrants, with the exception, of course, of Native Americans. They were already here.
Right.
But African Americans are involuntary immigrants. Most of us were the product of course, chattel slavery within the U.S. context. And so when I say that we're a special group altogether, there is no other population in the United States that has had to endure some 450 years of being terrorized, 250 years of enslavement, 100 years of Jim Crow, decades of bad public policy decisions which were disruptive to healthy Black family development, and then the new Jim Crow, which is mass incarceration. And so when, let's just say, if I'm from Nigeria and I decide I'm going to leave Nigeria and come to the United States, I'm coming with a culture already intact. I haven't lost anything. If I'm, let's just say I'm Nigerian, I'm a Yoruba or Igbo, I speak my language. You know, there's already a Nigerian community within the United States. Well, that has not been the African American experience at all. We had to kind of create something out of nothing.
Right.
And one of the most beautiful things that occurred almost 2 years ago now was when we inaugurated of the new Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture, because what that institution does, it tells the more than 500 years of the African American narrative. And let me just say this, one of the reasons why Black Americans really shouldn't be impressed with anyone coming here is our history is anchored in all aspects of US history. It is literally impossible to divorce the African American narrative from the American story. Impossible. If you're talking about institution building in terms of the Ivy League schools, they were built on the backs of Black Americans. State schools, indirectly,
Right.
built on the backs of Black Americans. The wealth of this country. There's a wonderful book written by a white scholar. His name is Professor Edward Baptist. He's at Cornell University, and he wrote the book in 2014. It's called The Half Has Never Been Told. And he critically examines the impact that African Americans have had, not on just the US South or the Northeast, but the entire country. Most people don't realize that from 1803 until 1937, the United States, the number one industry in the US was cotton. And in 1871, the US became the dominant economic power in the world. Now that's almost 150 years ago. And that wealth, man, was primarily made on the backs of African Americans. No other group has that impact. Even if you look at the Constitution, man, there's a wonderful book written by this author. It's called The U.S. Constitution in the African American Context. And that book is and if you critically look at it, is talking about African Americans probably more than any other group in the country. Because again, we're anchored differently in the United States. We're not the traditional immigrants where we're coming to America for a opportunity, individual freedom, family reunification, these types of things. No. Our ancestors primarily came as chattel, to build the structure and the foundation of this country. And that's exactly what we've done, man. And again, you can see our imprint in everything that's Americana. Everything from not only art, science, literature, music, engineering, inventions, it's all over the place. And so when I say that we shouldn't in any way be impressed by these immigrants, well, yes, immigrants have made their own unique contributions, but not in the same way that we have made these contributions, man. I mean, there was no structured model. And so we had to kind of create something out of nothing, which is quite unique.
Correct. Yeah, it's just again, even through all the diversity that Black Americans faced here in America, we haven't left in mass to go to other places the same way that what a lot of immigrants they face in their countries will leave to come to America. So we stick it out. We historically have stuck it out.
Sure. Now, I do want to say this, that there is an African American diaspora, right?
Right, but it's not like, we'll say a Mexican diaspora or I would say like a Nigerian diaspora. I mean, it doesn't compare. Even like an Irish diaspora, Italian diaspora, it doesn't compare to the immigrants who have came to the country.
Well, right, and that's correct. And let me just say this to you too, man. And this is true, and people really don't take this into consideration. The rights that immigrants enjoy in this country are directly related to the African American struggle. In essence, Black Americans made America better. We actually made white Americans better, because
Right.
if it was not for our struggle, civil rights, oh my God, man, everybody has benefited from the African American led civil rights struggle. Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, women, gays, people with disabilities. They've all basically, man, honestly, have benefited from our struggle for being here for 500 years. I mean, there is no other group that has actually had the impact that we've had in this country, period,
Mm.
as a distinct population. And again, our sojourn here is unique because, again, we didn't come voluntarily. And I think that immigrants, they don't quite know, people don't quite know how to identify with our narrative because it's unlike anybody else.
Hmm.
It's just not like any other group. And so they can't, they can't, they don't get it. But yet they have benefited, again, from the struggles that we've actually brought to the forefront for everyone else.
Okay, what let's break down, I guess, specifics in regards the I would say the sacrifices that African Americans made or had to go through in order to make the transition easier for immigrants to come to this country.
14th, 15th, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, and all of these things. I mean, citizenship. I mean, the end of slavery. These types of things, the right to vote. All of this stuff, man, was actually made on the backs of Black Americans. And as we talked about this before, and I don't want to jump ahead of this, you mentioned Booker T. Washington and the African exclusionary measures, where the U.S. is building the Panama Canal. They
Mhm.
needed labor. They looked to the West Indies for labor. Most of those West Indian and Central American Black laborers were used to build the canal after it was complete in 1914. There were some in the U.S. Congress who felt that those immigrants were going to try to immigrate to America for a better life. So they actually did an amendment to the immigration laws and says, you know what, we don't want any blacks coming from the West Indies or from any Black country. And as I mentioned before, Booker T. Washington found out about this. Washington at this time was the most powerful African American in the United States. He reached out to his Tuskegee machine, which were his power brokers behind the scene. And within 1 week, he had this legislation killed. And what I mean by legislation, this legislation that would omit blacks from coming into the country. He actually had the bill killed. And so after that, then blacks were allowed to come into the United States in 1915. And so again, that's another example of how African Americans, of how immigrants, non-white immigrants, have benefited from our legacy. And honestly, man, two things. I do think that the United States needs to do a better job when it's screening immigrants who are coming into the country. And honestly, people need to have a thorough understanding of U.S. history. And again,
Yeah, but I don't see the United States government, who's been historically towards Black people,
right.
making a point to ensure that immigrants know the
Well,
sacrifices that Black Americans have made to make it possible to immigrate to this country.
but also too, I think they're host countries. Let's just say if you're coming from someplace in Europe or what have you, the sending country should, I don't know what their protocols are for when they say, okay, you're free to go to America. And I don't know if they're giving people instructions in terms of what America is. Because I think far too many of these immigrants, when they see the United States, they see white.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't see the long history of Black Americans. For example, man, as I had mentioned this to you before, most people don't realize by 1800, 1810, 1820 or so, that 99% of the ancestors of Black Americans were already in the United States. We're actually 99.7% were already here. And so we actually have a long history of being in the United States. A very, very long history. But I do want to say, get back to why we shouldn't be impressed, because when you look at, again, our legacy in terms of what we've had, what in terms of what we actually have contributed to the country, and we didn't have any help oftentimes from the majority population, it really is an incredible story. And when you do come up to Washington, D.C., Dinas, and have an opportunity to walk through the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture, you'll see and you'll marvel at just how in the world could this have happened? How in the world could these people create all of these institutions, not only historically Black colleges, medical schools throughout the United States? You're talking about, of course, the historic churches. And as you and I have talked about the historic African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is a global institution now, and the work that they've done across the world. These are things that we have to kind of create for ourselves and pretty much by ourselves, man. And with no help really from immigrants coming from any place or from the United States. It's, as I said before, man, our narrative is just so unique. It's unlike any other group. And so I guess perhaps, maybe this is why immigrants who come here voluntarily can't identify. Perhaps.
Real quick, Professor Davis, simple question, one statement. Someone's saying that white missionaries created the HBCU. Is there any truth to that?
Oh, okay. Good question, man. Some of the schools were created in conjunction with white philanthropic groups. By the same token, let's just take, for example, Wilberforce University, or Bishop's College, or Allen College, or Livingston College. All of those universities that I named, man, are AME schools, which means African Methodist Episcopal School. So many of these HBCUs were created by and for Black institutions. Now, how? Go ahead.
No, I'm listening. Go ahead. No, you're good. Go ahead.
And I was going to say, for example, now Howard was actually the founder. He was white. Some of the schools were founded by white philanthropic groups in conjunction with the Black leadership of the day.
Okay.
And so I think what happens, man, oftentimes when we have these types of questions, people want to discredit the legacy of the African American narrative. And think about this, man. And I'm going to use the African Methodist Episcopal Church as an example again. This institution goes back to the 17th century, right? Created by and for African Americans, not by whites. 20 Episcopal districts across the globe. They've created universities across the United States, Canada, the West Indies, Africa, etc., man. This is an African American led institution, man, a global institution that, that had no real white involvement at all. None.
So Professor Davis, why, whenever Black people speak out current day in regards to injustices or discrimination that they face, are they thrown with look at the Chinese and how they're able to come here and be successful, and then this whole IQ, their high IQ, or look at Nigeria, like why did they do that?
Okay. Hey, Dinas, how long were Chinese enslaved in this country?
Never.
Chinese came over here with a culture intact, right?
Right.
Look, Dinas, I've actually traveled to 6 continents, and I've been to Chinatowns all over the globe. I've been to Chinatowns in Singapore, in Australia, in Canada, etc. And guess what, man? There's a cultural continuity. Now, as I tell people all the time, African Americans had to create something from nothing. We created from scratch something brand new, with no help from Africa. Africa has not assisted our narrative here in the United States at all.
Right.
Nothing.
Right, which gets to another statement. Somebody said, it was really 2 questions. How have African Americans benefited from immigrants here in this country?
How have they benefited from immigrants in this country?
Yeah.
Well, let me just say this. Immigrants, every immigrant who comes to the United States bring their contribution without question. They add to the flavor of the American experience without question. However, I would argue and say it has not been at the same level of our narrative. Okay, tell me the immigrants who were, look, the core, the primary wealth of this country was built on the backs of Black Americans. That's no argument at all. If you critically read the works of Dr. Edward Baptist of Cornell University, he's a white professor, brilliant guy. He'll tell you that. I mean, I would ask any of your listeners, who else has done that? What other group has actually played that central role, that core role in the United States in that context? I don't know of any other group.
I don't either.
I just don't. They actually see African Americans were the test model. we were the group that took the hit. Now, what do I mean by that, man? Dr. Gerald Horne at the University of Houston, man, written some 30-some books. You know, he said years ago, as I was listening to one of his programs, and I'm going to quote something, he says that African Americans have suffered kind of a special type of persecution, and we have. You know, and again, I said this earlier in your show, what other group of people has had to endure, and I want to say it just to make my point, some 450 years of being terrorized from white supremacy, 250 years of enslavement, 100 years of Jim Crow. Then after Jim Crow was over, decades of bad public policy decisions which are disruptive to healthy family development. And then after that, the new Jim Crow, which is mass incarceration. And with all of those successive ways to marginalize Black people, again, we got no real help from the African continent per se. Now, some of the West Indians did come and unite with us in our fight for struggle, but those were small numbers, and but they did come and try to kind of work in conjunction with us.
Right. And then the same person, Cohen Davis, says, what has the thanks been for the African American efforts?
I don't understand you. I don't quite understand what you mean.
How have me and you talked about this before? How have immigrants reciprocated back to?
Well, they haven't. You know, as I see it. I mean, I don't know of any measurable way that they have. I just nothing. And perhaps it's because we're uniquely anchored in the country. There hasn't been anything in any real measurable way. And so, like I said, we've actually in some ways made it possible for immigrants to come here. All of these laws that we've fought for, or the right to vote, and the right to end slavery, these types of things, man, these were really fought by Black Americans, really, primarily.
Right.
I mean, even the change in the immigration laws that comes on the back of civil rights, African Americans. And so again, there's this long legacy, and what the new Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture does, it tells that story. And one of the beautiful things, Diane, is that most people don't realize. Did you know that there were between 7,000 to 8,000 historic African American landmarks in all 50 U.S. states?
Did not know. No.
Yes. Now the one in Washington, D.C. is the largest. It's 400,000 square feet. And they attempt to kind of tell the broad story. But if you go to Maine and Vermont and some of these states that don't have a whole lot of Blacks, we still have institutions across the country because it's important that African Americans tell their own story. Mm-hmm. It's extremely important. And also, too, new Black immigrants, they don't have our story. They're not a part of our narrative, unfortunately. And oftentimes, those groups who are just coming to the United States tend not to understand the Black American narrative at all. And that can be somewhat problematic because I often say, if you're going to immigrate to a country, learn its history. If I'm going to go to France or Japan or some other country, I'm going to take the time to learn something about this country because it's going to be my new home. But I say this again, man. I mean, wherever you are from, or wherever you live in the United States, where it's Hawaii, there are AME churches in Hawaii. It is impossible to get away from the contributions that Black Americans have made to this country because we're anchored in the entire country. And I've said this to you before, Dinus, even in Canada, up until 1960, 65, most people don't realize that almost all Blacks in Canada came from the States. They were African American.
Right.
They were. And as I said before, that's why when we opened the Smithsonian Museum, that Black Canadians came and they celebrated with us because it stood that we have a shared history and a shared culture. So again, I will say this, that, well, go ahead. I'll let you continue. I'm sorry.
So someone in the Emmanuel Alujumu, he says, the young Africans are here to fix. Let me start from the beginning. He wants to know what's the way forward. Our ancestors messed up. The young Africans are here to fix the relationship. Can he at least acknowledge that?
Well, okay. Okay. So what's the relationship? Let's have a brief discussion here. He needs to kind of express a little bit more what he means. Could you ask him to kind of explain specifically what he means?
He says, I'm here to fix and reconnect, not to keep on starting problems.
I still don't quite understand where he's trying to go. I want to make sure that that I'm clear about what he's trying to say.
He'll type it in the I'm sure Emmanuel.
Right. And so fantastic. And well, and I think that and great. Look, listen, America is a nation of immigrants. I get that. And I have no issue with people coming to the United States because that's the country that we are. But I think that again, what is problematic to me is that these immigrants, and I'm not talking about Black immigrants. I'm just talking about immigrants, period. That they have a lack of understanding regarding basic U.S. history. I hear it all the time from immigrants that Americans are dumb or we're self-absorbed in these types of things. But what I find, man, is that a lot of immigrants really don't know who we are. And what I say, we Americans, and they know less about African Americans, which are core to the American story. I mean, again, I cannot express how central we are. For example, the Civil War, Dinus.
Yeah.
Clearly, the Civil War was fought over slavery, without question.
It was absolutely.
And so the slaves were who? The slaves were Black Americans. I'm not being rhetorical here, but that's just the case. And I often, and even if you take it into Canada, man, again, and when you look at Canadian culture, as I said before, man, much of Canada, in terms of its early Black settlers, African Americans began going to Canada as early as the 1600s and went there in successive migrations. And they populated Canada for a long time. And so, again, they were core to Black culture across Canada. And so, so these are some things that people tend not to realize. By the way, did that young man type in what he wanted to convey?
He says he's here. I'm here for formidable solutions. Please, Professor, I beg. The divisiveness is killing us.
Well, okay. And here's what I'm going to say. I'm going to have to continue to tell these stories.
Right.
Because if I don't, man, if African Americans don't tell their stories, no one else is.
Correct.
These black immigrants who are coming here don't have our narrative. They don't at all. Oftentimes, these Black immigrants who come to the United States, they practice white supremacy. Now, what do I mean by this? I cannot tell you the number of times that I have, that I've had to engage immigrants from the Black diaspora who would say to me, "What's wrong with you African Americans?" And I have to kind of sit down and decompress and just give them a history lesson of the United States, as if, okay, I'm thinking, well, maybe If you're first generation or second generation, maybe your parents didn't tell you or explain to you the history of the United States. And I find myself time and time again having to explain to immigrants the history of the United States and how Black Americans fit into the US context. And people tend to think that Black Americans are the same as any other immigrants, and it's not true. We're not the same as West Indian immigrants who are coming here. We're not the same as African immigrants coming here. We're anchored in the entire history of the country. And so this is something that people need to take into consideration. It's our history.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't get it.
There's a question in the chat room. Are you familiar with John B. Russworm?
I am. He's a Jamaican American. He was from Jamaica.
Uh-huh.
He had immigrated here from Jamaica. Oh God, I don't remember, in the 1800s. I think he was also one of the co-founders of one of the first papers. I believe it was in Pennsylvania. He ended up migrating to Liberia, where he served as the governor of Maryland County in Liberia.
Mm.
Yes, I am familiar with him. Yes.
The question is, did whites fund him?
He was half white, by the way.
Right. Mm-hmm.
He was half white, and so I'm sure because he was biracial, he basically, I do know that his father was white, mother was a Black Jamaican, and so he basically had some assistance from his paternal white side.
Okay. Let's hear. Somebody said, "Well, some Black Americans practice white supremacy as well," which I agree. What are your thoughts on that?
Now, when you say that we practice white supremacy, I'm not sure what in context this person is talking about. And I'm sure.
I agree. In context, I mean, I would say being very ignorant and disingenuous when it comes to issues that affect Black people.
Oh, sure.
Listen, always agreeing with the white, like they'll be the ones where, hey, Black people stop complaining. Look at Nigerians. Look at Chinese. Then you have to unpackage that, and then they'll still completely ignore it, ignore the legacy of what Black people have experienced here in America. And, they're the ones that will say, okay, well, look what happened to Black Wall Street. They'll be the ones that say, well, that's in the past. What are we doing now? Which, I mean, that type. And, basically white is right no matter what, and Black is always wrong. You got a lot of Black.
Oh, sure. There is a segment of African Americans who are apologists for supremacy, and they feel that, it's ingrained in their minds that white is better and so on and so forth. Oh, absolutely. Those types of people clearly exist as well. And so, yes, I will concur that there are elements of the Black American population who do practice and who do think in that way. No question about it.
Okay. All right, so let's see here. Professor Davis, who's responsible for Black America's oppression, mass incarceration, and non-existent economic cohesiveness?
Well, again, man, I just think that there are many Black Americans. And I think that and you just can't put 50 million people into one pot. Dinas, let me just start here. Among the African American elite, and you and I have talked about this many, many times, man, that the vast majority of those African Americans are married, two-parent household, send their kids to the Ivy League schools or to the top HBCUs. And those types of things like mass incarceration don't impact them at all. I think where mass incarceration, it generally impacts the poor and the undereducated African Americans. And I think that if you look at the history of the United States, a legacy of slavery and the prison industrial complex and these types of things and racism, this is also a part of it. I would say to the viewer, the person who called in, is to look at Michelle Alexander's work, The New Jim Crow, and she provides a clear outline, in terms of how the prison industrial complex and how the economy has had an impact on Black America. And I have to constantly again say this, Dinas, is that our narrative is unlike anybody else. It's a completely different story, and I think that because of historical marginalization, that has played a role. Now, with that said, there has always been a long history of blacks where they were able to gain wealth early on for over 200 years, and those ills have never impacted them. What I think should have happened, man, to the less fortunate African Americans is, we should have had a Marshall Plan a long time ago. If after the Emancipation Proclamation, America would have said to the black poor, you know what, we're going to make this path straight and provide, if you will, some type of Marshall Plan. I would say to you, or I would argue with you that a large segment of Black America would be better off today. Now, having said that, there are still a lot of us, man, who are not doing too badly.
Right. All right. Let's see. We had a couple more questions in the chat room. Someone was asking, which day do you think, Yvonne Sullivan said, I am late. I enjoy listening to Professor Davis. Told you, Professor Davis, you have fans.
Okay.
Thank you for joining us, Yvonne. Thank you. I'm glad you're enjoying Professor Davis. And then real quick, everybody, I had the sister Ingrid Gautier on today with us with Amarachi TV. So guys, make sure you guys go on Amarachi TV. Speak on those who are principally responsible for Black oppression.
Well, I mean, I think that I've spoken about that, man. I've given you a history of our legacy within the context of the United States. I've mentioned, the long history of marginalization through enslavement, and terror, these types of things. And so, again, I think I've stated the obvious in terms of our narrative, in terms of our sojourn within the context of America. I don't quite understand how else that we could explain it. Now, what's amazing to me, Dinas, is this. And I don't want to get off topic, but I do want to say this.
Go ahead.
During the transatlantic slave trade, roughly 13 to 15 million Africans were brought to the so-called New World, right?
Right.
Over 90% of those folks go to Mexico South. Only 450,000 go to the U.S. and Canada. Here's what's amazing, man, that by 1825, roughly 30 to 35% of all Blacks in the New World were African American, which means that, this group survived in huge numbers. And like I say, roughly 5% of the enslaved Africans were brought here. Mm-hmm. But we were able to kind of survive, thrive, create institutions out of nothing. And what's amazing to me, and it may not be to your audience, man, just imagine this, Dinas, is that African Americans had to exist against white supremacy in the most powerful nation ever on the face of the earth. Mm. I mean, honestly,
that's another show. That's another show. But go ahead. That's another show.
If you were in the West Indies, you were in the majority, right?
Right.
If you were in South America, you were somehow viewed as a part of the national culture, right? Like if you were in Brazil, well, white Brazilians had you believing that you were part of the national culture. African Americans were clear that we had this two-tier system, or race within the U.S. context was structured on bipolarity. You were either Black or white. And so we understood that, okay, we are under a system of white supremacy that the dominant population really does not want us here. And so therefore, we're going to have to create on our own. We are on our own. And so, but out of this unique situation, man, we basically, man, have actually had an impact on the globe through the creation of music and new cultural actions.
Real quick, Professor Davis. So somebody in the chat room was bringing this up, and they make somewhat of a point, but I know you can unpackage this.
Sure.
Brazilians don't think that. Do you think Brazilians probably went through worse than what African Americans face? Because I know. But go ahead.
Let me say this: the legacy of slavery in Brazil was longer. It lasted for
Mhm.
some 350 years. And keep in mind, man, that 38% of the slaves 30% of the slaves in the New World went to Brazil. You're talking about 5 million people
Right.
plus, right? And but the issue with Brazil, and let me just say this, man, race again in Anglo-America or in the Anglo world, in the U.S. and Canada, was structured on bipolarity. You were either black or white. Race in Latin America was structured on a color continuum, meaning that you could be from cream to coal, and unfortunately, you were not. Let's just say, for example, um, this is crazy. In the context of Brazil, right, Dinas?
Right.
I'm not black. Okay, I'm not black within the context of Brazil. I'm something else.
Oh,
A whole different
okay.
a whole different category.
Right.
And so it was. Now, don't get me wrong. Slavery in Brazil was absolutely it was rough. I mean, Brazil
guys,
did not out.
I've seen Professor Davis before. He's black, so I just want to get that out there.
I am clearly African American
Right,
without
exactly.
question.
I've seen him before.
Right,
He's African American.
right, right. And so my point being is that Brazil did not outlaw slavery until 1888. 1888. And so, but unfortunately, because the Portuguese convinced the Afro-Brazilians that they were part of the national Brazilian culture, unfortunately, what Brazilians did not do is to create long-standing institutions, right?
Right.
And so what you have in the United States among Black Americans, you have these institutions. You have HBCUs, you have Black fraternities, Black sororities, Black banks, Black churches, Black corporations. You follow what I'm saying? You have all of these long-standing institutions that we have to somewhat protect ourselves. And unfortunately, Brazil does not.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, think about this, man. Brazil, 55% of the population, 55% of the population in Brazil is Black or people of color, right?
Right.
15% of the population of the United States is African American. African Americans they're visible across the United States in all walks of life, politicians, so on and so forth. Afro-Brazilians are almost literally invisible. They have no institutions.
Right. Why do you think they did not? Why do you think they did not take the time out to build their own institutions? Because this is something that we notice in the UK as well, amongst Blacks in the diaspora in the UK. Why did they find value in building their own institutions? I guess.
Well, let me just say this honestly, Dinas, and it really isn't fair to compare. Let's just say the UK to let's just say Black America, because there's something that was called the Windrush movement, or this is in the 1940s is really when Blacks began to migrate to the UK in sizable numbers. Now, there's always been a small population of Blacks in England,
right?
But again, it wasn't until the 40s, the 50s, 60s, and 70s when they began to migrate in by the tens of thousands,
correct,
the hundreds of thousands into the UK. And so you're talking about a population of Blacks in the UK that's only been there for the last 60, 70, 80 years. And so therefore, and they're only 3% of the population in England. And so they haven't had any real time to create any institutions.
Okay.
And that's why.
Someone said Blacks in the United Kingdom arrived after World War II. They were there before then.
Well, sure, absolutely. There were small pockets. Now keep in mind, okay, Britain had, oh my God, Britain brought so many slaves to the West Indies, right? But those slaves were primarily in the West Indies. And there were very, very few slaves that they brought to the UK. And so there's always been a Black population there. Like for example, Dinas, During the American Revolution, there were Black Americans who fought on the side of the British, and they're known as Black loyalists. And so after the British lost the American Revolution, roughly 5,000 African Americans left the U.S. and they migrated to the U.K. Right, which really increased the population from roughly at that time, the UK roughly had 10 to 15,000 blacks, but with those 5,000 African Americans, it increased the population substantially, roughly 25%. And most of those earlier populations were, slaves who were either brought to the UK from Africa. Many of them were West Indians who were living there, but they were a tiny population. Keep in mind, the UK in the 1700s had a population of roughly 8 to 10 million people. And you're talking about what, 10, 15, maybe 20,000 blacks?
Right.
So it was a tiny, tiny population. And so, so they never really had a huge impact on the cultural and economic development of the country because they weren't there in large numbers. Now, they did impact the UK, but they were in the West Indies. And so that's how the UK profited from them, in the West Indies, because they weren't living in the UK in sizable numbers. I've been to London, and I think you have also too, right?
Briefly, not really. I need to go.
Right. And you'll find again that blacks there have very, very, very few national institutions because again they've only been there in sizable numbers for the last 70, 80 years, and that's it. Unlike African Americans who've been in the U.S. for over 500 years, and blacks in Brazil have been in Brazil a little bit longer, but as I said, because they were culturally integrated into the national population, they felt no need to build separate institutions. Like, for example, the African Methodist Episcopal Church is an African American institution. It's a global institution with a footprint on 6 continents, I believe.
Right.
And as a matter of fact, some Afro-Brazilians are part of that global institution. And so just to add to the AME, there's also the AME Zion, which is slightly different.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the AME was emerged in the 1700s. The AME Zion emerges in the 1700s, and the CME comes into existence in 1870, I believe, out of Tennessee. And all 3 of these particular religious institutions have built colleges across the United States and across Africa as well. These are African American institutions.
People keep asking, okay, you're giving us the history. What are some solutions?
Solutions to what?
I guess to what we've been discussing today, as far as you have a lot of.
Okay. Let me give you, in terms of engagement, and Dinas, you and I were online earlier, and Dinas, you and I were online earlier, and
yeah, we sure were. I know exactly where this is going. Go ahead, let's go.
Here are 2 examples of how we can actually close the gap or bridge the gap.
Right. Go ahead.
And as you know, Dinas, I've said this on one of your shows, the Africa America Institute, founded by Dr. Hart, African American. Dr. William Leo Hasbury, African American. They founded it in 1953 at Howard University. And this particular institution was set in place to ensure that newly emerging independent African nations had the leadership, economic skills, and political skills to take their countries forward. And if you fast forward until 2018, today, the Africa America Institute, or AAI for short, has a footprint on the ground in all 54 African countries. They've actually partnered with a number of major corporations. Many of them are African American led, man, to bring about education, training, and and cross-cultural understanding between the Black diaspora and the African continent. Another example is the Constituency for Africa, founded by Melvin Foote. He's a Black American, and I'm sure many of your brilliant callers or folks that you are engaging with online are familiar with the Young African Leadership Initiative, YALI for short. this particular program was founded under the Obama administration, and again, it's continent wide across Africa. And what they do is they bring young African students from all over to the United States to engage with African American institutions, other schools, so we can work in a collaborative way. So what I'm saying is that we're already engaging. We're already doing it. And these are just two. I mean, there are so many African-led institutions. The Whitaker Group is another one, which they work in terms of investments. Trans-Africa is another one. Africare is more grassroots. And so all of these institutions that I am naming are actually a part of the solution. Now, here's the issue. Here's the issue, Dinas. All of the organizations that I've named are African American led institutions. What needs to happen is we need to engage, we need African institutions to engage us. We've been there for a very, very long time. And I'll say this, first and foremost, I understand that most African countries are still struggling with just being independent for the last 40, 50 years, some less. And perhaps they have not had time to establish those institutions. Black Americans are unique in the sense that, again, we've been in America for 500 years plus. And so we already have these institutions in place, and they're working across the African continent, and they're doing great things. As I stated to you before, the Africa American Institute has actually helped prime ministers, presidents, Nobel laureates. They've actually launched the careers of people who were who actually now have Fortune 500, multi-million-dollar startups across Africa, and so on and so forth. And so, what I've mentioned, all of this is a part of the solution moving forward.
Okay. Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, let's see what else we have in the chat room. And Professor Davis, as always, thank you so much for coming on. Let's see what other statements we have in the chat room. I hope this answers your guys' questions in regards to solutions. Helena Black says, all of these programs are based in international development. They don't address any real issues between Blacks across the continent and the diaspora.
Well, that's not true at all. That is absolutely not true at all. And I would need for her to expound on that. And
Okay.
my question to her is, what are her solutions? What institutions that she knows of that are actually engaging like the institutions that I named? And what are the measurable results?
All right, so I'll give Sister time to
where are the results?
In fact, here's another question. Where's this question at? It's in regards to well, somebody just brought up Powernomics, which is Claude Anderson.
Sure.
How do you feel about that as I look for this other question that someone had?
You know what? I don't know a whole lot about Dr. Claude Anderson's Powernomics.
And I think, and just to give you, in fact, I know where he's going with this, and this ties into the other question I'm looking for. Until I guess Black Americans get our mouth is and started heavily investing into Africa, like Chinese and whatnot.
Well, and honestly, I think that's an excellent question here, and I think a part of the pushback, Dinas, is that again the Liberia experiment, and as you know, we were on the path to really transforming the continent, and and you know what happens. I don't want to kind of to get into what happened, and so I think that people are somewhat reluctant. Also, too, they look at the political structure of a lot of the African governments, and they're not seeing the type of leadership where integrity is at play. So people, if you can't trust a stable government, then you're somewhat reluctant to kind of engage.
Okay.
China is a $12 trillion economy. It's a huge country, 1.4 billion people. And China needs to land, and so on and so forth, and so they can engage in a more productive way. But my issue with China is this, man: the Africans who are negotiating with the Chinese, are these partnerships in the best interest of the African people?
Of course not.
Howard French, who wrote the book China's Second Continent, he's an African American scholar, professor at Columbia University. He somehow is reluctant, and he does not believe that these partnerships are really in the best interest of the African people, and that China is really, and I hate to say it, in some ways, the new colonial master of the African continent. And so so what he suggested is that African leaders need to really critically think through these types of partnership and how they can serve the best interests of Africa going forward.
Okay. And then there's another statement. Yeah, the Chinese are for themselves. Yeah, we know that. Yeah, but I mean that's but how do you feel about powernomics as far as somebody wanted to know what do you think Black Americans would be better off building their own country or starting their own country somewhere?
Well, you know what, and that's a good question. I honestly think that probably the best thing to do is maybe a small enclave somewhere, maybe on the African continent.
Should we build from there? Go back to Liberia. That's the.
Oh, it's my God, man. That's what. Wow. You know what? I was listening to an interview by Dr. Tyreen Wright. You and I have spoken about her before. She wrote the book about Booker T. Washington, the making of a Pan-Africanist. And Dr. Wright was being asked that exact same question: should we really try to resurrect Liberia? And her thoughts were no. That maybe we should, that we should move on to another part of Africa where we can use our institutions to engage. I guess less corrupt African leadership, and so Liberia. What I would say about Liberia is this: should we still engage with Liberia? Yes, but only at the level of our institutions.
Okay. So you're saying we should find, kind of like what Canada Genesis is saying, find an enclave and build.
Absolutely. And listen, Dinas, there have just been look, here's something that's important too. The Black diaspora, the African American diaspora. We settled in Canada. We also settled in the Bahamas, Trinidad and Tobago, of course, Liberia, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Australia. And Dinas, every place that African Americans went across the globe, we became the political and economic elites of those societies. And honestly, that has been confirmed by the renowned African American scholar Dr. Gerald Horne at the University of Houston. We did exceptionally well. We didn't go in large numbers, but we did well. We did very, very well, man, in terms of leaving America. But I do think that maybe someplace, perhaps in Africa, maybe in Southern Africa, Liberia. Well, I think that that somehow the relationships are still strained, and after the coup, Liberia has not recovered, as you are well aware that in the 1970s, Liberia had a per capita income that was equal to that of Japan, and it was one of the most It was the most successful nation on the African continent, but because of a number of complex reasons, that is no longer the case.
All right, a couple more questions, and then I'll let you close out. So now, since we're speaking on building an enclave in Africa, are you familiar with the Finakra in Ghana? The Finakra?
No, sir, I'm not.
You're not? Okay, all right. So I'll ask somebody else that question. So what we'll do, everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Please get the likes up since you guys are while you guys are in here. But what we'll do, we'll go ahead and close out, Professor Davis, and just in closing, unless we could, anything else you want to cover, we could take our time. But
no, and I just wanted to say that immigrants who come to the United States need to thoroughly understand the history of the United States. And if you really want to know what America is, you have to understand the narrative of America's domestic Black population, because this particular group of people is anchored in the entire history of the country. It's a unique group. It's unlike anybody else. Its contributions are massive to the American story. Its contributions are massive to the Canadian story, and so I wish people took the time to learn this. We're not traditional immigrants at all. We had to create something brand new that is uniquely American. I'm serious. I tell people, Dr. Henry Louis Gates said that that African Americans are probably the most American of all people. Because we've been shaped by this country in so many ways, and we've shaped America in so many ways, and so that's what I would say.
Yeah, go ahead.
Are you there?
Yeah, I'm right here.
The people really benefit from it, and in unique ways. And if they ever get a chance to come to Washington D.C., please tour the new Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. It's a huge institution. As a matter of fact, it's the largest institution that is dedicated to a people of African ancestry anywhere on the globe. It's some 400,000 square feet, and it tells the more than 500-year history of the African American experience. And one unique thing it does do, it tries to be somewhat inclusive. And what I mean by that, it also adds the stories of Caribbean immigrants to America, Afro-Latinos, and also some of the recent immigrants from the African continent as well.
Okay. All right. If you could get everybody your contact as well,
sure.
How to contact you.
If any of your viewing guests have additional questions for me, please have them reach out to me at Davis, Davis, L as in Larry, N as in Nathaniel, 20750 at yahoo.com, and I can answer any of their questions. And I thank you for having me on your show and allowing me to share this information with your audience.
All right, no problem. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Make sure you subscribe, share, and like the page. Also go to Search for Uhuru on Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, and Facebook. Also Africa Personified on those same platforms. Also go to searchforuhuru.com, go to dynasamir.com. Also go to amazon.com, search your name, Dynasamir, please buy a book, and go to africapersonified.africa. Professor Davis, are you saying something?
Yes, and I just want to say one thing. And the young gentleman who asked the question, he sounded like he had a Nigerian name or an African name.
Emmanuel. Emmanuel.
Right. Oh, continue. I'm sorry.
No, that's his name, Emmanuel Alujumu.
Yeah, and I just want to say to Emmanuel, we are already working together because, as I stated before, there are many African American led institutions that are working across the African continent and the Black diaspora, and so those connections are already being made. My purpose for today is just to share some of the history, or to list a number of African American led institutions that are already doing the work, and so we're already slowly but surely closing the gap and making those connections.
All right, Professor Davis, we appreciate it. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Dynas, take care of yourself.
No problem. And everybody, please, before you leave, go to amarachitv.com. Go to amarachitv.com. Again, Sister Ingrid Gauthier was on earlier today, and is an info on all the social media platforms that she has connected to it as well. So that's AmarachieTV.com. Please check it out. All right, the link is in the, there you go. The link is in the chat room. So please go check that out, subscribe. Having our own media platform is important. So please support that. So everybody, till next time, peace.